Cynthia Lewis, and I'm Wendy Carr. Yes, you need to make sure you're in the right place because there have been quite a few changes on the schedule. We are going to be looking at English as additional language learners, and FSL, that really should be FAL as well, French as additional language programs. What are the challenges and possibilities? And what we propose to do today is to look at two studies, one that I conducted and one that Cynthia conducted, and then more important, talk about some themes and recommendations and questions as we move forward. Shelley's just talked about some real strategies that school districts and schools can use to bring out the best in learners. And so what we'd like to do is propose the same kind of strategy. So talk about two studies and then work together to see what we can possibly do in terms of recommendations. The questions we're considering today: what are the benefits and challenges to teaching FSL in contexts where children are learning English language skills, literacy skills, whether they be English as additional language learners or English as first language learners? My study focuses on the English as additional language learners. And what are some common factors that can be highlighted? We know, my study was actually grounded in the notion of the Canadian ideal of bilingualism, linguistic duality. So very apropos to this conference, and took place within the implementation of intensive French in British Columbia, the first IF program, that's okay, in British Columbia. And we know, as we've learned through French immersion, that not all parents enroll their children in language programs of choice for idealistic reasons. Sometimes they're very self-serving, they're very instrumental, looking at a commodified view of language, and that's fine. They're entitled to their reasons. But some parents, and this has come out in Callie Mady's research in Ontario, and it came out in my research in British Columbia, a number of EAL parents are highly motivated by linguistic duality, the bilingualism ideal of Canada. They very much want their children to be full Canadian citizens, and they see that learning French as well as English will bring them that identity. Implementation in Surrey looked a lot different from implementation in of intensive French, other jurisdictions. We have a great deal more of English as additional language. In fact, more than half of the children in intensive French speak a home language other than English or French. So this is the way we do business in Surrey. It's BC's biggest school district, 64,000 students. These are some of the home languages that are spoken. Punjabi, Korean, dialects of Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese are the most common among the IF schools. But this is a very common makeup of our schools in Surrey. So it was a wonderful bed in which to conduct research on intensive French because most of the other jurisdictions had a very high English first language population. So this was really, even when we showed the pictures of Surrey schools, it looked very different from other contexts in Canada. So we not only examined the French acquisition, of course, and have contributed to the national data set, but we were able to conduct a very interesting study asking the question, does learning French in this context, this FSL context, enhance EAL learners' performance in English? The short answer is yes, it does. But just to let you know how we got to that, yes, a 3-year study involving the 5 schools was conducted in looking at French oral and written proficiency. I've just, in fact, completed the 3rd year of data last week, so those data will not be part of my representation today, but the first 2 years are. And I used the Woodcock-Munoz language survey as a pre and post measure. And English as additional language students in the intensive French program significantly outperformed the EAL learners in the regular English program in English, as well as in the, and then they outperformed, so not at quite as high a level in their reading and writing. I'm not presenting all the data at all, but just one graph to show that even though the starting points are slightly different, there was a slight elevation of skills among EAL learners in the IF program. And I did as best a job as I could identifying the children based on their testing in English as an additional language. That said, there were still some differences at the starting point, but you can see there's a much wider range at the end point, so that students starting IF in grade 5, working at about a 4.5 English level, ended up their intensive French year working at a grade 7 English level. That's a significant increase compared to their peers who stayed in the regular English program. We know why. We know some of the theories behind this acquisition of English from work in immersion. We know that the metalinguistic skills, etc., are operative. There are a lot of reasons why. We also know that the pedagogy and the curriculum focus in intensive French are highly literacy rich. We learned this morning through Joan and Claude some of the elements of intensive French, very project-based. In fact, children are not burdened, if you like, with content learning during those first 5 months. They spend most of their day engaged in an English language arts program. So it gives them a chance to really get inside of how do I make meaning from oral language? How do I make meaning from text? How do I express meaning in this new language? And it gives them a chance to develop insight into undoubtedly their home languages and into English. So what does this mean? What are the implications of this? We're going to examine those after Cynthia talks about her study, but it's something for us to be mindful of, this additional learning, these benefits that occur to our English as additional language learners.
Thanks. I was privileged to be Assistant Superintendent of Schools in Surrey when Wendy began her study, and intensive French began in Surrey. So I know that she's done a bang-up job of this case study of the implementation in our what I consider to be our district. I am semi-retired now, and I do some contract work in the area of school effectiveness. And it occurred to me that it would, because I've done now 12 case studies of schools in British Columbia, highly diverse schools in British Columbia, who had literacy focuses, who were working with vulnerable students. These schools identified themselves as having many ESL students, many poverty-stricken families, Aboriginal students, transients, highly transient students, and they created action research projects around improving literacy in their schools. And I was the participant researcher. I guided their research and I also wrote it up. And from that research, which was not about French programs, there are some themes that go together, I think, that can help us see the way forward. So I'm going to speak very briefly about some of those themes, and then we're going to get on to some participating recommendations. Some of the themes that came out of working with these schools who worked with vulnerable students was the importance of shared responsibility and leadership. So that speaks to sometimes distributed leadership, right? That speaks to the isolation that sometimes we hear French immersion teachers, core French teachers, intensive French teachers speak about, that they're the only one carrying the ball in that school context. So really we have lessons here about the school level conditions that promote student success, and why should second language programs, and I speak now broadly, immersion, intensive, core, Punjabi, Spanish, Chinese, how can those second language programs become part of these school level initiatives? They have things to contribute and things to learn about what conditions we set up for student success. And Shelley's talk and other talks, and yesterday at the beginning, the fellow from the Council of Europe who spoke about how can we get past the silos and start working from the point of view of the plurilingual student themselves and the family, and what learning looks like. So that's what these things will speak to. Obviously, these schools who were struggling to improve the literacy results of their students, who were considered to be vulnerable, put a lot of emphasis on building community and reaching out to families and having families truly understand the school. And you know that when families don't speak English, perhaps are not familiar with our school system, are school phobic. It's very hard to get those families to come in and really understand what's going on in the classroom. And that's a really important factor. Another important factor is collaborative professional action. We need to create the conditions for teachers to work together around their goals and to share their practice, especially in the induction phase. New teachers and more experienced teachers who need to retool all that stuff from Louise Stoll and Lorna Earle about rehearsing, refining, retooling. We need to create those conditions for language programs teachers as well. And we really need to start understanding what personalized student learning looks like. And I think that we have a great opportunity now with the possibility of the language portfolio to really understand assessment and learning from a personalized point of view. So, I'm just going to say those things, really. And you can see, you can come up, have a look here, and we're also putting this PowerPoint up on Wendy's website, and so that you can access it afterwards. I think I've probably addressed. Let's just talk a little bit more about the personalized student learning. Some of the things that these schools who were working on literacy with vulnerable students learned about language was the importance of balanced literacy, investment of the child, engagement of the child in the material, in the content, and a cultural responsiveness. I mean, if you're going to read a text, pick the text really carefully for those reasons. And enabling classroom assessment practices every day which build feedback for the student that they really understand their learning and which build resilience with vulnerable students. All the assessment for learning stuff, right? And I think we have a wonderful opportunity with the portfolio. Personalized interventions and profiles of student learning by subgroup and individually. And flexible groupings, that's the special ed piece, not just the pull out, get fixed, or this child is broken, or whatever, you know, but teachers working together in the school-based team to really understand the student's strengths and areas of weakness, and that differentiated instruction makes its way into classroom practice every day. And sharing students becomes the norm amongst the staff. It's not my students or the grade 2 students or whatever, they're all our students. You know, schools who are really into this have a list of the 150 kids that they have that are the most vulnerable in their building, and they know what that child's day is like. They have a profile of that child. Everybody can walk up to that child in the hallway and say, how's it going? How's your mom? They know some background. They know the things that child is going through. Those things are really important in keeping those kids going in school. I mean, I'm not even going to start on the poverty, the impact of poverty on school achievement that Jim Cummins talks about just very recently, how that seems to get ignored all the time. There's a huge body of work by Ruby Payne, Understanding Children in Poverty. Relationships are the key motivators for learning for students from generational poverty. So if you want to keep vulnerable students and students from diverse backgrounds, students who are not, you know, there are no perfect students anymore. The parents haven't got those students at home. They send their best to school. We need to educate everybody. Language program people need to get right on board with that concept. Everything is possible, whatever the language program is that you're trying to implement, immersion or intensive or core. But we're keeping them all in there. We're not sending them off down the hall to some other class. We're keeping them in the program that we've got. So, what are the common themes then? How can we put Wendy's work together with this work? Wendy's going to do some typing.
Well, let's look
at and here you go.
Themes. Some common themes, and then what we'd like to do is just hear from you and incorporate this into what we have today. So we've got a second slide with other ideas. So we can speak in very large terms, and I think we need to. These are what ideals are. They motivate us. They give us hope, a place to strive for. But we also need to think sometimes in just really nitty-gritty, like, let's keep that child in our class. Let's accept that we're going to find a solution within our class. So we want to attend to the identities of students. We We want to build connections to home languages. What are some ways that we can do that? Validate and celebrate home and learned languages, and the language portfolio is really one of the brilliant ways that we can do this, to for real, so that this really, and so that the unilingual child starts to say, hey, this child has something that I don't have, and it's not a deficit, because that's often how unilingual children and their parents view English as additional language learners, as the problem of not speaking English well enough. Well, they speak English well enough. They also speak additional languages, and they're learning French in most of our schools. Becoming contributing members of school and district literacy teams. This is for teachers, for principals, for everyone in the school. Looking at real-life communication so that there are reasons why children should. They understand that English is a real language. How can we help them understand that French is also a real language? And make that a focus in our classes, and look at different language delivery models. Understand that intensive programs can advance English learning at a faster rate than a smaller exposure such as core. So are there some things that you're doing, that you've seen, that you would suggest, that could help push along the agenda in a way that is helpful for children and communities and families? Over to you.
Or you have a question.
Or a question, yeah, about what we're doing in BC. Yes, Shelley. So the question is the European language portfolio being used with intensive French? Not yet, but we are looking actually at a provincial policy, which is exciting, at the ministry level of incorporating the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada are looking and have been looking for a couple of years at the framework. And now at the provincial levels, we are looking at ways to incorporate. So this would be a question of looking at language outcomes, can-do statements for children in all second language programs and in the regular program, because so many English as additional language learners are there. So it's coming, is the short answer. Yeah, it's coming. Tony. Doesn't it?
So I guess it's a question I have more than anything else. You said that look at these immigrants, these newcomers to the country, and it's a stigma to have their mother tongue. Do teachers in the school system still look at French as a frill? Some of these kids don't even, until they learn to speak English, why bother to get the French?
You know, I really think it has a lot to do with the ethos of the culture of the school at the school level. I just recently spent 3 days in the most inner city secondary school in Surrey that seems to get great results given the nature of the clientele. And what we've learned from that, we're going to do an in-depth case study of what that school does well. What we learned from that is that every department, including the languages department, has huge passion. They keep more kids to grade 12 French than the majority of the other schools in the district because of the passion and the attitude they take. I walked into a social studies 11 class full of kids who were learning English in their second or third year and trying to pass social studies 11, and the teacher said the topic was NGOs and world aid. You know, the teacher said these folks are experts. They come from the countries that we're talking about. Like, they really go the mile trying to really capture what is engaging for those kids in their backgrounds, including languages. Why shouldn't they get? You know, it should be front and center. They're good at learning languages.
Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you. This PowerPoint presentation is available on my website. I'm president of the BC Modern Language Teachers Association, so if you remember that and the name of this conference, you'll find it there. Thank you.